to the third episode of Korean Cinema Today. Korean Cinema Today is the new podcast from the Korean Film Council, and in Seoul this is Pierce Conran, and we're here to talk about Korean film and what's going on in the industry today. As I said, this is a new podcast from KOBIZ, which is the Korean Film Biz Zone, which is the online portion of the Korean Film Council. If you want to keep up with the latest news and features or interviews and much more in Korean film, make sure to check out koreanfilm.or.kr. We also have a webzine of the same name, Korean Cinema Today. There's a newsletter that you can subscribe to, and of course you can tune in again to this podcast. To listen to us again, you can find us on iTunes and just type in the keywords Korean Cinema Today. Also find us on Twitter at twitter.com/Korean Film Biz, that's B-I-Z, or at Facebook, we can be found at facebook.com/kobiz.kofic, that's KOBIZ.KOFIC. This is your host, Pierce Conran. I am a journalist for KOBIZ. You can find my writing on the websites. I'm also a Korean correspondent for twitchfilm.com and the founder of Modern Korean Cinema, a blog on What Else? Korean Cinema. So today we have the very great pleasure of welcoming Korean film expert Darcy Paquet, the founder of KoreanFilm.org, into the studio. But first, let's have a quick look at some of the big news items in Korean cinema today. So we have the Asia Pacific Screen Awards recently occurred. There were a few nominations for Korean films, 3 in all. 2 of those nominations turned into wins. Lee Byung-hun, for his role in Masquerade, was awarded the Best Actor prize. That is actually the second year on the trot that a Korean actor has won the award. Choi Min-sik won for Nameless Gangster last year. Kang Ji-won's Juvenile Offender, the very popular indie, won the Best Children's Feature award, while The Fake unfortunately missed out in the animation category. Also, producer Lee Chun-young, who was the president of production company Cine 2000, was given the Lifetime Achievement Award. A few Korean shorts are being recognized at international festivals. This year's Sundance will feature Park Jae-in's animation Peace Peace, that's Peace P-I-C-E and Peace P-E-A-C-E, whereas Clermont-Ferrand International Short Film Festival, a very illustrious event, has programmed Jung Ji-yeon's The Boy and Kim Baek's The Incredible Shrinking Man. A lot of casting news near the end of the year. We have Jung Woo-sung is going to star in the new Im Pil-sung film, which will be a retelling of the Shimcheong fairy tale. Jung Woo-sung had a strong year this year with Cold Eyes. Im Pil-sung was one of the directors for Doomsday Book and previously made Antarctic Journal and Hansel and Gretel. Seo Kyung-gu and Kang Woo-suk are getting back together again for their fifth film. Following the Public Enemy franchise, all 3 of those installments, and the movie Silmido, a huge hit in 2003. We'll be talking about that a little bit later today. They are making the film Two Policemen, which is a Chosun era set, kind of revamped version of Kang's very popular Two Cops film, which was released 20 years ago, and starred An Sung-ki and Park Jong-hoon. A huge hit back in the day, spawned 2 sequels. Kang Dong-won and Song Hye-kyo are going to star in the new Lee Jae-young film, who recently last made Behind the Camera and Actresses, and one of his very big films, of course, is Untold Scandal. An Sung-ki is set to star in Im Kwon-taek's 102nd film, which will go before cameras soon. So a lot of new films on the horizon with some interesting combinations of star power and directors. Han Gong-ju, fresh off its double award win at the Busan International Film Festival, was awarded the top prize at the recently finished Marrakesh International Film Festival from a jury that was presided over by Martin Scorsese. It also won a special award at the recently finished Seoul International Film Festival. A Korean Directors Showcase is taking place in Beijing. The Korean Film Council is operating a China Business Center there, and a number of directors and producers, screenwriters, and cinematographers will be taking part in the event to share their knowledge in the hopes of activating some new co-productions. Now we'll have a little look at the box office this week in Korean cinema. There was not a Korean film at number one. The top film at the box office with almost 500,000 admissions and 30% of the market share was About Time, the new working title romance film. Working title, of course, behind the very popular Love Actually, which was so well received here that it will be going on a re-release run later this month. Horror film or sequel, Insidious Chapter 2 was number 2. It had almost 250,000 admissions. Behind that was the sci-fi 11 a.m. starring Jung Jae-young. The film got off to a decent start last week, but unfortunately it fell quite hard, and it's now may not reach the 1 million mark. Next was the animation Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which is hanging in there and is gently making its way towards the 1 million mark. Directly behind that was the multi-strand rom-com Marriage Blue, another Korean production, which just made it over the 1 million mark. Next week, there will be some bigger films entering the marketplace. The Korean film Way Back Home with Jeon Do-yeon and Go-soo just opened it's doing some solid business. But number one will most likely be reserved for the second in the Hobbit trilogy. That film is having some very strong reservations and will likely be on top over the weekend. Next up, our interview with Darcy Paquet. Today we have Darcy Paquet in the studio with us today. It's great to have you here today, Darcy. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
So Darcy is a very distinguished individual in the Korean film field. He is the founder of KoreanFilm.org, and a wonderful resource online. He is the author of the book New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves, and he is also a consultant for the San Sebastian International Film Festival in Spain and the Udine Far East Film Festival in Italy. So today we're going to have a little look, since it's the end of 2013, we're going to go back in time 10 years and consider a little bit about what the Korean film scene was like back in 2003. Many people consider 2003 to be one of the best years of Korean film, and Darcy was here when everything was going on, so we're going to pick his brain a little bit and see what he thinks about what was going on in 2003. So we'll start off and ask, what were you doing here in 2003?
Well, at this point, I'd been living in Korea for 5 or 6 years, and I was working as a correspondent for Screen International magazine, and also doing some part-time work for Kofik. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd been running the website for a few years at this point, and so I was watching a lot of Korean films and following it quite closely. And throughout the course of the year, it's kind of slowly dawned on everybody that this was really kind of a big step forward for Korean cinema in that year.
So how did, going into the year, how did the Korean film scene feel back then?
Well, it was interesting because I mean, the Korean cinema had some success in the years leading up to that, of course, with, blockbusters like Shiri and JSA. In 2001, there were a lot of comedies that did very well. 2002 is not a great year, and to be honest, at the beginning of 2003, I think a lot of people, critics and people in the film industry were feeling sort of concerned. The whole recent success of Korean cinema still felt kind of precarious. It isn't like now where it's this very established industry. And there was a sense that, a few wrong steps could kind of take everything back to the way things were, maybe in the late 90s or something.
In terms of looking at the overview, in terms of quality, would you agree that 2003 is one of the best years of Korean film?
Yes. This is the year that I pick as kind of the high point. And I wrote an article about this last year, actually, when, at the end of 2012, Korea had set a new box office record. And so in one sense, you could call it the best year ever. But I think if you look kind of more broadly at the quality and the lasting impact of the films that were made in that year, I think I can't really think of any other year that quite compares to it.
Absolutely, I remember reading that article. So, what were some of these films that have made this lasting impact for you?
The two big ones were Memories of Murder and Old Boy. I mean, both are these huge classics that I think many people outside of Korea have seen as well as inside.
So Memories of Murder came first that year, is that right?
Yeah, Memories of Murder, it came out at the end of April. And this was... it was interesting because in some ways there was a lot riding on this film's success. And critics were very nervous about it because if this film failed, there was a sense that there would be lasting consequences. I mean, both for the production company. I mean, this was produced by Sidus Pictures, which was run by Cha Seung-jae, who was one of the most important producers at that time. And a few weeks earlier, Save the Green Planet had been released, which I really loved, a lot of people really loved, but was a big flop at the box office. And, you know, there's a sense that one more big flop might spell the doom of this company. But Memories of Murder turned out to be this huge hit. You know, it sold over 5,000 tickets, and it impressed everybody with, you know, the quality of its filmmaking. And so that brought a bit of optimism back into the film industry, I think. Sure.
And now, of course, I'm such a huge fan of Memories of Murder. That would be my favorite Korean film. So you saw it quite early, of course.
Yeah, actually, my wife and I did the subtitles for this film. And so I watched it on video in my bedroom about a month before it actually reached the theaters. You know, the director and the film company wanted to submit the film to Cannes, and so they prepared a subtitled version in advance. Yeah, and it was obvious from watching the film. I mean, when you subtitle a film, you watch it kind of over and over again, and individual scenes you see over and over. And, you know, you spend much time with that film and you realize it's something really special. So I was excited to see it released in theaters and happy when it did so well.
I can imagine. How was that initial response when it first came out?
I went to the press screening, which was a couple of weeks before the actual release, and it was at Seoul Theatre, if I remember correctly. And afterwards, you know, there's a crowd gathering in front of the theater as people usually do, and but critics were obviously really excited about it, and after seeing the film, they were confident that it was going to do well.
And crucial, both a critical and a commercial hit. So then Oldboy came later in the summer. Was it in August that it came out?
Even later, it was October that the film was
Of
released.
course it was, right. It was a 10-year anniversary recently.
Yeah, and that was a somewhat different case because the very first screening of that film was actually not in Korea, but it was a market screening at the American Film Market.
That's right.
At the beginning of November.
We had an interview recently with Soyoung-ju, and she mentioned how after coming out of that market screening, the reaction was so positive. She knew she had a hit in her hands.
Yeah, I was hearing little bits and pieces of the response from people who had been there, or, you know, on the internet there was word leaking out that, you know, this movie was something really unusual. And I think I missed the press screening that year, but I did see one of the advanced screenings. And, yeah, it was just one of those, you know, times that, you know, if you follow Korean cinema for a long period of time, there are certain moments that you remember. And, you know, watching Oldboy for the first time is, I think, kind of a milestone for a lot of people in their personal viewing history.
Definitely. It was one of the very first ones I saw. Going back to tiny bits, actually the first Korean film I ever saw in a theater was Save the Green Planet. And that was quite an experience. It was a midnight screening. I was by myself, and I had no idea what I was getting myself in for.
Yeah.
Now, I know you're a fan of the film. Of course, the film didn't do very well, but it's become kind of a cult hit over the years. How do you feel about the film today?
Yeah, I mean, whenever possible, I try to steer people towards that film because, I mean, even though I think fans, like diehard fans of Korean cinema, know what it is and they respect the film quite a bit, casual fans of Korean cinema are unlikely to have heard of it. And yeah, I think it's a kind of film that probably couldn't be made today. It's very ambitious, and it was trying a lot of different things, and it was made in this era when I think people were willing to kind of take more risks with Korean cinema. And this is a good example of how I guess both the positives and negatives of that if you're willing to take great risks, then you're sometimes able to create something quite remarkable. But even if you do, it might not be commercially successful.
Certainly, the failure at the box office of the film was a big problem for the director, who had a long road towards his sophomore film. Jung Jin-hwan eventually made Hua Yi, which came out this year, and it was maybe a moderate success, and it was kind of received a mixed reaction from critics. But looking at some of those other films, Memories of Murder and Old Boy, those directors went on to more things, and they're being headhunted by Hollywood at this point. But some filmmakers didn't continue to be as relevant for 10 years. What do you think about that? There's some went on to do well, some didn't. Was it just a question of success, or did the directors change over time?
I don't know. I think it's a combination of, I guess, talent and luck that determined the fate of a lot of these directors. And it was a really special time in the sense that if you established yourself kind of in the early 2000s as a really important director, then you were able to retain this sense of creative freedom going forward. And so when Bong Joon-ho makes a film right now, he can basically do whatever he wants, I think. It's obviously he has to, think about financing, and, he has to hear the opinions of his investors, and I'm sure there's compromise involved in making his films, but for the most part, he's able to make the kind of film that he wants to make. Whereas with Jung Jin-hwan, if you compare that situation, I think with Hua Yi, this was a film that was written by another screenwriter, but certainly he wouldn't be able to just take any project that he wanted and then kind of, realize his complete vision in a film today. And that's true for almost everybody in the film industry, that, the commercial pressures are stronger than they used to be, and there's less of this broad consensus for risk-taking. And so I think that the fortunate and the talented directors who established themselves, around 2003, they're the ones who are going off and making movies in Hollywood, and who do have a lot of kind of potential in the sense that they can do almost whatever they want. But they're kind of operating in a different universe from the rest of the Korean film industry.
Certainly. So whereas a film like Save the Green Planet was not commercially successful, it did eventually find kind of an audience, especially overseas. But are there any other films in 2003? I'm sure you saw quite a few that you feel were neglected and haven't been thought about much in the time since.
I don't know. I think in the broadest sense, I think the best films from that year did receive at least a fair amount of attention. A Good Lawyer's Wife by Im Sang-soo is one film that came out that year, and that did screen in competition at the Venice Film Festival. And it's quite a surprising film. Even if you go back and watch it today, it's kind of surprising just how strong it is. And so that, I think it did receive the attention it deserved in that case. There was Untold Scandal by Lee Jae-young, which was both commercially and critically successful. A really interesting mix of kind of, it's based on a French novel and then adapted and set during the Chosun Dynasty. It's a really interesting mix of East and West in that film. And that may not have made a big impact internationally, but it was still a big film for the director that was judged to be a big success. And he continues to make interesting films, although mostly smaller than that film. And there were other, both commercially and artistically, there were a lot of attempts in 2003 that didn't work out very well. Wonderful Days is one example of an early Korean animated film that was very expensive and was shot in English. And that film, it had a moderate level of success in the sense that it did open in the U.S., but certainly didn't live up to the expectations of the producers. And I guess that's true for every year, but when you look through the list of films, there are films that seemed like a good idea but didn't quite realize it. But I think the broadest, the biggest successes of 2003 did more or less receive the recognition they deserved.
And so, it was a very successful year commercially, but really when we look back on it, we look back on the quality of the films. why was it just that at this time there were all these great films? Was it a perfect storm of various elements?
Yeah, I mean, it may have been just the fact that they'd kind of reached the sweet spot between the earlier, somewhat chaotic industry of the late 90s and early 2000s and the much more systematized industry right now. I mean, back then, a lot of people used to talk about the need to kind of rationalize the filmmaking production method in Korea. And there was this effort to, kind of raise the standards of productions and the production methods that were being used in Korea to, with Hollywood somewhat, I mean, not the absolute model, but somewhat of a model in terms of, the process of writing the screenplay and then developing the film and shooting it. Now, I mean, some people would argue that perhaps it's a little too systematized, that they've been a little too successful in doing that, and that films have become a little bit too slick and polished. But 2003 was certainly a year when, I guess, standards were rising, and it wouldn't have been possible to make a film like Memories of Murder or Old Boy in 1998. But the capabilities of Korean filmmakers were expanding, but they still had a significant amount of creative freedom back then as well.
Now, something about the timing does seem very important. We have these the filmmakers that had kind of those big moments with Park Chan-wook of Old Boy, Bong Joon-ho with Memories of Murder, Kim Ji-yoon with A Bittersweet Life, Kim Ki-duk of Spring, Summer, Autumn, Winter, and Spring, and many more. They've gone on to do many more things, be recognized overseas in festivals, and they're still doing a lot of things today and being recognized for it. But we're not seeing as many directors coming out subsequently that have those kind of successful careers.
Mm-hmm.
Was it again also just a kind of a perfect storm for them? For there was just a moment when directors could kind of make their mark, and is that kind of moment? Is it almost gone? Is it too hard for someone to come out and make that impression these days?
I mean, I wouldn't say that it's impossible, and certainly there are directors whose first works have created a big impression in the past few years. I mean, Na Hong-jin with The Chaser is one example of, a director who clearly showed his potential in that first film. But I think that it's a more competitive environment right now. There are huge numbers of qualified directors in Korea. Every year there are, just tremendous numbers of students graduating from film school, and all of them, with ideas and this ambitions about, establishing themselves in the film industry. And, we're in a situation where it's difficult to make your debut film, but it's even more difficult to make your second film, I think, and to be successful with that. And so personally, I think the talent is there, and but the opportunities are not, and it's there are many different factors perhaps with this. Partly it's just this sense of competition, but also perhaps, there may be directors now who have made one or two films who we respect, but, if we look back in 10 years, we'll realize that was the start of, a really important career, and we didn't realize just how important they would grow to be in the future.
Speaking of retrospect, now if you look at a film from 2003 these days, how does that make you feel?
Well, it's really interesting looking back because, you certainly watch the film differently. At the time, Korean cinema was, this kind of upstart cinema. So you kind of viewed these films as underdogs in a way. And they had a lot of energy, and just so, there was, as an observer of Korean cinema, you wanted to kind of jump in and support them and kind of push them out to the world and encourage as many people to see them as possible. These days, I think there's much more attention being placed on Korean cinema, and festivals look very closely to see what is happening in Korean cinema. And so when you look back, there is kind of a different style to the films in some ways. They're not quite as polished, but not necessarily in a bad way. Another interesting thing is when we look back in retrospect, the actors, the actors have gone on to establish themselves in various ways, and a lot of the supporting actors who were not very big at the time have turned into stars, since then. And so often when you look back at old Korean films, they seem to have this incredible star power when, in fact, at the time they didn't. It's only in the years since that, you know, the stars have become really famous. Yeah, and so there are many ways that you see the films differently when you look back on them now, and it's interesting to do that.
Sure. So, were you around much on the festival scene at this point? There must have been far fewer Korean films, but surely some of these would have made an impact. Now, you do some programming for San Sebastian. Was Memories of Murder invited there?
It was. This was before I worked for the festival, but San Sebastian is very proud of the fact that they invited both Bong Joon-ho's debut film, Barking Dogs Never Bite, and Memories of Murder to their competition section. And so, in a sense, they did, discover Bong Joon-ho. They were the first festival to really push his work. I remember, when I was working on the subtitles for Memories of Murder, my editor at Screen International asked me if there were any Korean films that I thought were likely to go to Cannes. And I'm like, oh, I'm sure they're not going to turn this down. This is a great film. They're going to take it, I'm sure. But they did turn it down. And it's interesting because it does kind of reinforce the fact that these big festivals, partly it's the quality of the film, but partly it is the name recognition of the director. And, in 2003, neither Park Chan-wook nor Bong Joon-ho or Kim Ji-yoon really had any name recognition for most of the people going to these festivals.
Right.
These days, it's much easier for them to get their films into a big festival than it was then.
It's amazing that Memories of Murder didn't go to a big festival like that. Granted, Old Boy did go the following year, and won the grand prize. But he wasn't a very big name. But surely, when you see that film, well, that's just my personal opinion.
No, it's true. And Park Chan-wook had made Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance the year before, which is another film that really impressed many critics, and that was a film that I was kind of hoping or expecting might go to Cannes in 2002, and it was overlooked. And Old Boy was an interesting case because it was originally invited just as a midnight screening, not in the competition section. And at the last minute, it was moved into the competition section. And I wish I knew exactly what happened and by what stroke of fortune, it was moved in there, because if it had only screened as a midnight screening, then certainly it wouldn't have made the impact that it did.
Definitely. And even looking, that year, Quentin Tarantino was the head of the jury, and he came out as a huge champion of Old Boy. I heard that he wanted to give it the Palme d'Or, but there was perhaps some political reason that it went to Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore's documentary in the end. But again, these films in 2003 prompted a lot of people in the West to really kind of take notice of Korean film.
Yeah, it's true. And that was the start really of kind of a broader international recognition of Korean cinema. And as someone who was writing about Korean cinema, I could feel that because I started getting more emails in the subsequent years from people who had, discovered some Korean film either on DVD or at some festival, and they'd become curious to learn more about it. And so, this was the time when there was a real momentum building internationally.
It must have been very exciting. Of course, 2003 was the first year that I ever saw a Korean film. It wasn't a 2003 film. It was actually Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. But I very quickly, once they became available to me, those 2003 films, they really got me hooked. And I think the same is true for many people.
Yeah. What is your favorite 2003 film?
It's definitely Memories of Murder. There's no question.
Okay.
Now, these films, Old Boy, Memories of Murder, A Tale of Two Sisters, Untold Scandal, they're sometimes labeled with the term well-made film. Now, what do you think of that label, and do you think it still applies to some of the films being made today?
Yeah, it's an interesting label. It's sort of like well-being in the sense that it's an English word that was adopted into Korean, and the meaning itself kind of expanded in Korean. And so it means more than just, a well-made film. In a way, it's referring to a certain type of a project in the film industry. And it's contrasted to blockbusters, which are, big budget films that are kind of built around spectacle and maybe star power. They're big genre films that we're hoping to just kind of wow the audience. But there are also a lot of high concept comedies, especially in like 2001, 2002. This had become really the most successful sort of film in those years. And so, these were comedies with a very simple, catchy central concept. Didn't necessarily have big star power, but recognizable stars in it, and a lot of them were doing quite well. And so, well-made films, it was actually defined at the time as kind of a film by a director who has a strong individual style. A bit more focus on things like the mise en scène or just the overall production values of the film, and often they did get a fair amount of star power. Actors like Song Kang-ho would usually willingly sign up for these films because just they were attracted to the quality of the film and the prospect of working for a talented director. And so people began to refer to these type of films as well-made films. So Memories of Murder and Old Boy and A Tale of Two Sisters and Untold Scandal, these were, and because they were all really successful in 2003, it became kind of a catchphrase. And it distinguished, it was used in contrast to like the high concept comedy or the blockbuster.
Right. Like these high concept comedies, like a lot of these gangster comedies, I think there was 5 of the top 10 films in 2001 were all gangster comedies. Very successful here, but not so easily marketable abroad.
Yeah,
whereas
definitely.
Well-made films, they did make an impact.
Yeah, it's true. The comedies, they were successful in selling remake rights, but movies like Memories of Murder, Memories of Murder did do fairly well, for its time in terms of its commercial releases in France and Spain and the US. And so they did kind of have more export potential, I guess, than the high concept comedies. Although the blockbusters also, the big genre films did also sell fairly well at that time.
It's kind of been the mainstay of the Korean film industry. So the industry today is in the midst of incredible success, and but the reasons are quite different at this point. As you say, it's become much more established, very polished. What exactly is different 10 years on?
To me, I think the biggest difference, and I go on about this sometimes, but there's been a power shift in the film industry, whereas in 2003, 2004, there were a number of well-established producers who just had a tremendous amount of power in the film industry. At the time, the film magazine Cine 21 used to publish a Power 50 of it was a poll of people in the film industry, and they would indicate the most powerful figures in the film industry. And often it was these big producers who would rank at the top. But I think in the time since then, I think especially in the industry crisis of 2007, 2008, many of these producers lost a lot of their influence. Not completely, but in a broader sense, a lot of the power shifted to the big studios and the investors. And so, I think if you look now at the producers who are still active, who were both active at that time and who are still active now, you can see links in the kind of films they're making today with the kind of films that were popular back then, in being very commercial but also somewhat distinctive in terms of style. I think that in a broader sense, I think that the style is changing perhaps because the investors are having much bigger say into the creative process.
Certainly, that seems to be a problem plaguing a lot of the successful industries around the world.
Yes.
We would like to see that kind of great quality happen again. And intermittently, we do get some great films, but it's certainly a different scene than what it once was. Okay, well, that's about all the time we have. I'm sorry to cut this great discussion short, but thank you very much for being in the studio with us today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
For this week's In Focus, where we choose a strong new Korean film that is available in the Kobe's online screening, a resource for film professionals, which can be found at screening.koreanfilm.or.kr. I want to talk a little bit about Hangongju, a film that I am particularly keen on, but has had a divided reception. The film premiered at the Busan International Film Festival a few months ago, where it picked up 2 awards. It shared the Citizens Reviewers Award with Shuttlecock and won the CGV Movie Collage Award. Just last week, it's picked up the grand prize at the Marrakesh International Film Festival, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, and also won a small award at the Seoul Independent Film Festival. The film follows a girl who has had to change schools for an incident that has occurred that we are not immediately made aware of. And she doesn't really settle very well into her new surroundings. She's actively doesn't try to make any friends. She doesn't live with her parents anymore. And slowly, as the film acclimates us to this character, we are eventually some light is shed on what has happened to her in the past. Now, what happens to her, it would be spoiling it to say exactly what it is, but it does involve sexual violence, and it is it's very affecting. In fact, it's often just very overwhelming. The film has a really strong central performance from actress Chon Woo-hee, who has the very difficult task of playing this high school girl who's quite sweet on the surface, but is hiding this kind of deep swell of pain. She does very well, as does the rest of the cast. And this is a debut film from director Lee Soo-jin. And you wouldn't really think so. I didn't realize it was a debut as I watched it. So confident is his handling of the mise en scène. It was really quite impressive. But the film will be remembered for its subject matter and how it treats it. Some people feel that it was not handled so well. It made some people angry. For others, like myself, I was swept up by it. So it's not a film that everyone's going to love, but I think it's definitely one worth checking out. So again, that's available on the online screening, which is screening.koreanfilm.or.kr. So thank you for joining us for our 3rd episode of Korean Cinema Today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Korean film expert Darcy Paquet, and make sure to subscribe by visiting us at koreanfilm.or.kr or finding us on iTunes by searching for Korean Cinema Today. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening, and tune in again next time.